Hi, everyone. This is Charles Hoskinson broadcasting live from warm, sunny Colorado. Always warm, always sunny, sometimes Colorado. Today is February 9th, 2023, and I wanted to make a quick video to talk about staking and regulation and the vogue topics of the day. Undoubtedly, many of you have seen the CoinDesk article that came out today, probably about an hour or so ago, that said, hey, Kraken and the SEC are about to settle over some concerns the SEC had about staking that they offer on their platform. Also, Brian Armstrong tweeted yesterday that the SEC is looking aggressively into staking services. And no doubt they've probably had some informal or formal communications through private channels. So it prompted me to reply to that tweet because someone asked me to, that I said Ethereum staking is somewhat problematic. And I figured I'd make a more extended video, talk a little bit about the landscape and what's exactly going on. So we have this issue where there is no canonical definition of what delegation, staking, liquidity, custodianship really means. So Avalanche and Polkadot and Tezos and Cardano and Ethereum and Algorand, and even though these are all staking systems, they actually have very different modes of operation. Some are custodial and non-liquid. Others are liquid and custodial, non-custodial. Some involve a bonding or slashing mechanism. Other ones involve no bonding and slashing mechanism. And the problem is that in those nuances actually really do translate to regulatory overhead. So one of the first challenges from a regulatory perspective is if you have an asset and you have to transfer that asset to another party for them then to do something on your behalf to generate a return. In some jurisdictions and some interpretations, that actor doing that may be a regulated actor. Why? Because they have a custodial risk and potential information asymmetries. And also, your returns are 100% based upon their efforts and their efforts alone. You're not in a common enterprise where you're working together. Rather, you have just lent or given with an expectation of return an asset to them to do something on your behalf. This is where the rub kind of comes in. When you compare that with a Bitcoin model of Bitcoin mining pools or a Cardano model with a Cardano stake pool, the custody of the underlying asset, in the case of Bitcoin, it's your hash resources, so your actual work payload. Case of Cardano, it's the synthetic resources. They still belong to you. And what you've done is you've delegated it to them, and now you're collectively working together, you and others, to perform an action, to build a block. And only if that work is done are you guaranteed a return. But you have to actually do the work to get the return. Okay, so it's a very different model, and there's no information asymmetry. You both know the same thing. There's no custodial risk, and the return is as based on your efforts as it is based on the efforts of the pool. But both of these are technically proof of stake. And the matter gets further conflated and contaminated when you also look at the fact that a lot of these staking services, they go beyond staking and potentially put it into some sort of DeFi play to augment the yield, which means that perhaps there's a risk there. Or in some cases, to give you liquidity, they issue a synthetic asset and say, here's this thing, and it has redemption rights. There's all kinds of variations here, especially if there's a bonding component and there's an opportunity cost to losing access to those funds. Okay, so none of this is figured out. And every jurisdiction is going to have a slightly different opinion. And it's very clear that it looks like the SEC is converging to a point where perhaps, the very least, that exchanges doing this on your behalf is problematic. Now, I'm not going to complain too much about exchanges getting out of the staking business because, I would like small stake pool operators, and I would like staking to be very distributed and decentralized. And it feels intrinsically uncomfortable if one entity has 40% of the resources and basically they don't even own that asset, and yet they're able to vote with it and stake with it and do other things. It's probably better to pull that off of exchanges if possible. So that's a good thing. But that said, it is an inconvenience to the industry as a whole. And that's because uh, what usually happens is they try to apply one size fits all interpretations and understandings to nuanced things. So, if Ethereum staking, for example, in its current model, with the majority of its actors, is a regulated activity, they may just decide that all staking is a regulated activity and say, well, fuck you, litigate it in court, and we'll figure it out. I'm not saying they're going to do that, but I'm saying that is in this spectrum of options and possibilities as a result of these actions. And obviously, if there is a settlement between Kraken and the SEC, something will come of it, and we can read more and kind of dig into the facts and circumstances and try to really understand where the problem point is in the analysis and why people have issues. But again, it's a very nuanced topic. So if you're a stake pool operator and you may become regulated, or there's a pseudo regulation, there's layers to that. With the infrastructure bill that was passed in the United States, there's this unenforced statutory mandate about this concept of collection of information about the people that you have a business relationship with. So it was a stupid thing. Toomey and others really tried hard to remove it from the bill, and unfortunately, politics got in the way, and it passed with a very bad provision. A strict interpretation of the U.S. infrastructure bill would say if you're a stake pool operator and someone's delegated to you, you have a KYC requirement to know enough about that person if requested to be able to provide that information to an actor like the IRS or something like that. Okay. Now, in practice, Treasury Department says they're not going to enforce that. This said, it is an interesting question about starting to change staking models to accommodate regulatory nuances. So on the Cardano side, one of the discussions we've had for a while, and we just haven't had the time to write this up, but we'd like to do this maybe as a work product of the MBO, is writing a SIP to introduce the concept of a new stake pool certificate. Right now, when you want to be a stake pool operator, you register a stake pool certificate on chain, and that's that. And then people can delegate it to it, and these are push transactions, meaning that as an SPO, you don't consent to them. They just come your way until you saturate. Well, you can introduce a concept of contingent staking, and basically it's two-sided multisig. So how that would work is that if Alice wants to delegate to Bob's pool, Alice would send a transaction, it would be pending, and Bob, the stake pool operator, also has to sign that before they can broadcast that transaction as a legitimate delegation. Now, the idea is that there'd be a metadata payload, and Alice would provide some information to Bob, like a DID or something, for Bob to then feel comfortable. And then Bob would actually have records about Alice. But this changes a push non-consensual relationship to a bilateral consensual relationship. I mean, both parties had to agree to it for it to work. Now, this is not just for regulatory purposes. Many of you in the Cardano ecosystem get involved in things called ISPOs. And there's usually some sort of promise where they say, delegate to my pool, I keep the ADA revenue for a while, and then I'm going to keep a ledger and track what your return should have been, and then give you tokens in another project. Great. But then you'll notice a lot of these guys say, I'm sorry, we can't do this for US citizens for a variety of reasons. Okay, so they blacklist the United States, and a lot of people do that. Well, how they tend to reconcile is that when you go to redeem the tokens, they say, all right, prove who you are. But you've already given them the money. You've already given them your stake pool rewards. So with contingent settlement, what you would do is before any business relationship is established, you would generally have an exchanging of information. In this particular case, it wouldn't just be a KYC point to verify that you're not a US citizen. You'd probably have them sign a contract, some form of distribution agreement as well, saying, I agree to the following terms and conditions. I make the following warrants and representations, et cetera, and they sign it. And actually signing it with the transaction is a legally binding thing. It's a digital signature, and both parties sign it. Okay. So if you audit that stake pool, they would have the compliance log, and 100% of the participants have an upfront contractual relationship. So both of these would be introduced with contingent staking. Now, as a regulated entity, let's say they just say stake pools are now regulated. The interesting thing would be, could you operate where you syndicate the license of an actor. So, for example, maybe an RIA or whatever the regulatory structure may be, maybe they can provide basically a white label where you can be the operator of the pool, run the pool, but you're running under the license of that operator, and other stake pools are as well, or you can become a direct regulated entity. If regulation goes in an uncomfortable and wrong way for our industry, this might end up having to be the way that people run stake pools in the United States. Or they could use contingent staking to blacklist US delegations. So you have a regulated and unregulated set. Welcome to really bad regulation. This is the route that we're going down. And until Congress passes a law, basically reining in very unreasonable agencies, we're probably going to be dealing with this for the next 12, 24 months. So we're tracking it on our side. There's certainly a lot of great technology that can be brought to bear to try to optimize and reduce the overhead and make the life of an SPO better. It's important to point out, as it stands right now, it does not seem that any complaint about the Ethereum custodial staking model is transitive to the Cardano liquid non-staking model. And it's certainly something that should be litigated if somebody asserts that, because I think it's completely wrong and there's no facts and circumstances to equivocate the two. I think we fall under the same work package model as Bitcoin mining pools, which have been in operation for almost 13 years in our industry without incident or complaint. But obviously there's going to be a national discussion now about these things, especially now that Kraken and others are getting involved. It does not appear that there's any attempt to say, oh, well, staking mechanics somehow now make the underlying asset a security. You'll probably see a lot of FUD over Twitter, Reddit, and other places saying, oh, well, if staking is a security, that must mean the underlying asset is. So Ether is now a security, or ADA is now a security. Let's be very clear. You can take wheat, which is a commodity, or gold, a commodity, and put it into some sort of package or structuring where that package is a security, or that activity that you're doing with it is regulated. But that doesn't make wheat or gold a security. So you don't have that transitivity there where what you do with stake pools could infer the underlying asset has a problem. And we haven't seen any attempt to do that at the moment. Now, obviously, again, governments are unpredictable. Facts and circumstances could change, and we see things the same time you guys do. So we'll cross that bridge if it comes. But as it stands right now, the ecosystem is fine. So I don't think there's any issue with Cardano as it sits. I don't think there's any issue with our staking model as it sits. Unfortunately, conflation of what Ethereum is doing with Cardano may drag us in an uncomfortable direction, and we as an industry have to work on these nuances and details. The good news is that there's plenty of other ecosystems that have more sensible consensus models, and as a result would likely litigate and fight bad things. And obviously exchanges and other operators are going to have to figure out how to operate. On our side, we can do things proactively, like using Avtala Prism and DIDs and contingent staking. If we want to scale up as an industry, as an ecosystem, the regulatory side. And obviously there's all kinds of arcane legal structures that can be put together to syndicate regulatory oversight if and when that comes to the staking pool model. If you're an SPO right now, it is not a regulated business, the best of our understanding. But again, things can change. So it is something to think about in your future planning, 12 months, 24 months, 36 months. Or maybe all this goes away with the US government changing from one political party to another, and they're more reasonable than the current one about the status of cryptocurrencies in the United States. Or maybe a law is passed that creates statutory clarity about where and when and what we're supposed to do. Like FIA had this concept of an auxiliary asset, for example. Until then, we're still living in the regulation by enforcement paradigm. And until then, we're still living in the we'll let you know and best of luck situation, which is the absolute worst way of running an economy. It's the absolute worst way of conducting business. It's ultimately counterproductive and destructive. And all it does is convince people to offshore and blacklist the United States, which is happening en masse now. And our loss is Dubai's gain, and our loss is Switzerland's gain and other jurisdictions. It's not to say there aren't bad actors. Every industry has them. FTX is the pinnacle of that for our industry, but it's just one of many that we've dealt with for almost 14 years now, whether it be Silk Road or MT Gox or BitConnect or OneCoin. These things do happen. And oftentimes they have the exact same structure, which wasn't the crypto. It wasn't a failure of a protocol. It was a centralized actor saying, trust us. You trusted them, and then they screwed you. By the way, custodial staking does suffer from this problem. If you give your funds to somebody else to do something with them, they can screw you too. That's why regulation exists. Regulation comes into play when these problems are there. Now, as always, my comments on Twitter, which were solicited, people asked my opinion, were then taken and turned into a cryptocurrency article. Always happens. And that article was posted on cryptocurrency Reddit. And then, people basically said I'm the worst human being alive, and Charleston's an idiot, and pathological liar, and read this book, and rah, rah, rah. That's the level of maturity of discourse in a lot of the channels in our industry. I will remind everybody, the only way we're ever going to get out of this was a satisfactory outcome, meaning that we have our liberty and we can operate and build great things and go chase the future, is if we come together and treat each other with civility. It is perfectly reasonable to point out that protocol design choices people have made may inadvertently create problems in a regulatory viewpoint. That's just a fact, and that's where we're at, and it's creating a systemic problem for the industry. It's not fair that when people criticize that and say we now have to deal with the consequences of those decisions, to just basically attack people. Because at the end of the day, how the hell are we actually going to come together and solve these problems? Is what it is. And I will continue doing what I can on my part. We'll continue doing what we can as a protocol and an ecosystem on the Cardano side. And I hope we as an industry can find sensible ways to come together. Spoke before Congress last year and didn't mention Cardano once. Tried to represent the industry as a whole. I will continue doing that where and when asked, and I'll continue trying to advocate for sensible policy so every single actor, not just us, but every single actor has fair and equal consideration for their business operations, and the government gets out of the way of innovation. We as an industry must acknowledge that there have been bad actors. And we also must acknowledge that many of those bad actors were enabled by many actors who still are prominent people, still raise money, still are in charge of money, and have felt no recourse for their actions. It's kind of like South Park with the BP CEO saying, "We're sorry." And if we are tolerant of that and accept that, and we live in that reality, we have to expect that at some point it's going to invite increasing escalation of regulatory scrutiny on the industry, because it's clear we're not self-regulating as an industry. Just a fact. It's inconvenient, but it's one you have to live with. And if you want to shoot the messenger, go ahead. Cryptocurrency Reddit's great at that. But it doesn't change the reality we all have to live. And the facts and circumstances we're converging to. I do believe technology can solve a big chunk of this. But at the end of the day, there's an old axiom: if you trust somebody, they have the power to screw you. Just human relationships. So you have to understand that for every business relationship, every time that you turn over your private keys to someone else, and they're now in charge, that you're taking a leap of faith. And be very careful who you get into bed with, because you might catch fleas. Other piece of news, real briefly, finally got the data room for CoinDesk. I'm under NDA, so I can't mention anything about it. But if anything comes of that, obviously make an announcement when that's not in violation of the NDA. So I just wanted to give a brief update there about that, because you guys keep asking about that one too. We'll keep you in the loop about things as they materialize on the regulatory side. Cheers.